computer. All right. Welcome, folks, to this Tuesday. We are going to be talking about Jordan Peterson today, or more precisely, Roger is going to be talking about Jordan Peterson, and we will all join in. I want to tell you, as people are coming in, we're up to 33 people. As people are coming in, let me tell you about what's coming up. On Wednesdays, we do Meditation Wednesdays. We've got incredible group of people who are experienced in meditation, who are going to present on meditation and actually conduct meditation exercises. Tomorrow, we're going to be discussing Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. Plus, we've got a gentleman called Spencer, who's got decades of experience in meditation, who's going to be talking to us about his style of Buddhist meditation. So that's tomorrow. On Thursdays and on Sundays, we're doing a new series on Carl Jung. It's called Carl Jung on Becoming Yourself. And that is about his core concept of individuation. You know, how do you become individual? How do you kind of maximize your potential? That's what it is about. And I have an incredible group of Jungian experts. This Sunday, we had 6 Jungian psychotherapists and psychologists doing a panel discussion. So we're going to have only panels with top quality people talking about Jungian ideas. So that's what is coming. We had up to 97 people. So folks, please get in early. There is a limit of 100 people here. So please get in early, especially on Thursdays and on Sundays. On Fridays, my friend John is doing a series on self-improvement. This time, he's going to be talking about urgency as it relates to mortality. On Saturday, we have Stoic Saturdays. I've got some of the best-selling authors from Amazon talking about Stoicism and how you apply it to your life. So this Saturday, it's going to be Dr. Matwichuk. I think that's how he pronounces his name. He's going to be talking about Stoicism and rational emotive behavioral therapy. So that's coming up on Saturday. And on Mondays, we discuss best-selling books. This time we are discussing a book called Behave by Sapolsky. It's a very deep book on neuroscience and behavior and evolution. And on Tuesday, Roger will be back talking about Jordan Peterson. So that's what is coming up. With that, you know, I'm delighted to have Roger. Roger has been running the Jordan Peterson Meetup in DC for the past 3 years. And I'm delighted to have him here. So let me just hand it over to Roger. Let me tell you about the format. What we're going to do is that Roger is going to be presenting. And I will ask him some kind of clarificatory questions to make sure that everything is clear to me. If it's clear to me, hopefully it is clear to you. And after that, we are going to open it up for Q&A. So you can keep asking your questions in chat, and we'll come to all the questions. After the Q&A, we are going to break up into small groups of about 6 to 8 people each, so we can talk about these ideas in great amount of detail. We are going to do 2 rounds of breakout rooms. First is going to be about 20 minutes, and the second one is going to be 20 minutes, but second one, you can stay as long as you want until the conversation goes. So that's the plan. So with that, over to Roger.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, I guess night, evening. And today we're going to be talking about the shadow. And this is kind of an interesting topic because, especially from a Peterson's perspective, because he mostly builds on what Jung's already established. He has his own take, but his own take is only a more detailed view of kind of the Jungian perspective. So the way I'm going to approach this topic is I'm first going to try to give a brief connection between how this idea seems to develop through time, mostly through 3 different perspectives. So there's the Nietzschean observation, and then after that, the Jung's kind of actual creation of this construct of the shadow, and then I'll be elaborating on how Peterson kind of elaborates and gets more detailed as to what it means, the effects it can have on you, and how you can integrate different parts. It's the first half is going to be pretty technical and a little bit dense, but then the second half is going to be much more practical and much more example based. So I know some people like the much more abstract conversations and others like much more practical. So I'm trying to get a little bit of both on that. So just a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. First, I'd like to just go over a general history of the concept and how it evolved. And then after that, why it's important to understand, why it's a good idea to know what the shadow is and what it may contain. And then we'll also talk about how we can integrate our shadow better. And then finally, we'll talk about some practical ways in which you can actually do that proactively. So first and foremost, we start with Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, late 18th century philosopher, probably most renowned for his criticism of the church. And in one of the things that he had pointed out, especially with the church, was this concept of morality that they used. And for Nietzsche, I don't want to get too bogged down into this idea, but essentially his ideas were there's a master morality and slave morality. And the master morality was kind of based on this idea of what things improve you and what things make you better to achieve, to self-actualize. So in other words, would you rather be powerful or not powerful? Would you rather be wealthy or not wealthy? Would you rather have these things? Would they be useful or not? And in that, it is a dynamic of good versus bad. It's good to be powerful. It's bad not to be powerful. But for Nietzsche, he also noted that there was a second morality that for him, he believed was kind of being held by the church. And he called this the slave morality. And the reason it was a slave morality was it was essentially an inversion of that morality. Rather than the powerful, the rich, the empowered people being desirable, it was flipped. It became a philosophy of kindness, empathy, sympathy, and all those things that were seen in the master morality as positive or desirable became evil, became unpious, right? And for Nietzsche, the slave morality did something here that he found reprehensible, but that Jung later picks up, and that is that you disguised your cowardice as virtue. In other words, because you can't be powerful, you just change the rules of the game to say that being powerful is actually not a good thing, and God actually wants us to give up all our worldly possessions. If you're rich, it's not necessarily an indicator of a good thing, but rather an indicator of your greed, and greed is bad, right? And it's this subversion of the accomplishments of the powerful. Now, the next thing, sorry, my girlfriend's also on Zoom and she's screaming around. The next thing is that before this was even, Nietzsche at this point is talking about psychology before there's psychology. And what he's pointing to is what's now known as cognitive dissonance, which essentially means you hold one belief, but your actions don't match up to it. And this idea that normally what a lot of times the way that gets resolved, because your actions are a lot harder to change than your beliefs, you simply morph your beliefs into your actions. And that's essentially what Nietzsche was pointing out. And kind of to make this more concrete, I was trying to think of a good example. And I found that the nice guy was a perfect example and embodiment of this. And I think most men can identify, especially if when they were really young and they first entered the dating scene, this sentiment that you walk in and you don't really know how to be social, you don't really know the games for dating or courtship, but there are plenty of others that do, and that do have that skill set. And at least that was what I found in my college. And what I found was it's a very tempting thing to resent those men. And there's two interpretations that you can take. The first is you can take this interpretation of, oh, well, those men are just better skilled, better social, more sociable, more interesting. They've developed themselves better. They know how to flirt. They know how to be charming. Or you can take the more slave morality perspective of, oh, those guys, those are they're womanizers. They don't even respect women. They are just after, an easy night. If a woman were to select me, a moral gentleman that, exudes the highest of values, I would treat them correctly. But, just that's what's actually happening. They just don't see, right? And what you see is a very natural and normal conversion of the morals to fit to what my inability was, or what any young man inability is the inability to achieve something that they desire. So therefore they make their current situation the virtuous one. So mid 19th century, Jung comes in. And for Jung, he's greatly influenced by Nietzsche, and not just this aspect, but in many, many aspects. And one of the biggest contributions that Jung does is he creates the Jungian Psyche. And it's this map of what he believes our psyche is. And for those that don't know, it's made of several layers. I won't go too into detail, but just a quick breakdown. The most external and visible layer is the persona. This is the layer of who you show yourself to be to everyone else. It's the most visible one, because it's not just visible by you, it's visible by you and everyone else. One layer below that is the ego, which is your own conception of yourself, how you see yourself and how you believe you are. It's essentially your own mapping of you. And then Jung believed there's another layer below that, which is the shadow. And it's essentially all the parts of you that are unconscious, all the parts of you that you aren't aware you have. And there's another one that's called the self. And for those that went to Sunday's talk, the self is essentially the mechanism that tries to reunite the ego in the shadow. Because for Jung, as you're growing, as your ego is developing, it is developing and at the same time splitting off from the shadow, essentially because you can imagine a child being born, and as they're growing, certain things get reinforced and certain things don't. And the things that get reinforced, therefore, get repeated because they're reinforced. And the things that aren't reinforced, or that, worse yet, are punished, kind of get repressed and pushed down. And the things that get repressed and pushed down by either your own ego, by society, or even just because you've never had to use them, stay in the shadow. And this also includes your anima or your animus, which for Jung was the masculine or feminine traits of your personality. So if you're man, you were likely socially pressured to embody the masculine traits. And any display of feminine traits, especially in even more conservative cultures, were very quickly repressed and pushed back and pushed down. So for Jung, the idea is all men have a feminine traits inside them, and all women have masculine traits inside them. And that's also contained within the shadow. And for going back to that little sleight of hand that Nietzsche identified, for Jung, he identified that tendency to hide your weakness through virtue is actually something that everyone does. And the worst part is that when we do it, we're not even conscious of it. So then you hide your weaknesses by assuming that what you're doing is correct. And that's how they, in a way, become invisible, because the strategy you're currently using already works. And you don't need to look at the things that you haven't been looking at, or the things that you don't want to accept about yourself. So that's essentially the Jungian shadow from Jung's perspective. And now I'm going to jump to Peterson's point. Shrikant, is there anything?
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to get back to one relationship. You started talking about the conception of morality. And then you talked about kind of this Jungian concepts of persona, ego, shadow. How does a person's view of their own morality and what they think the morality of the culture is influence what ends up being in the shadow? What's the connection between the morality of the culture, morality held by a person, and their shadow?
Right. So that will come into play, especially with Peterson, because Peterson explicitly points out that once you choose a self-conceptualized category, you also choose a moral structure. And once you choose a moral structure, that becomes a direct, it essentially becomes a box that you can't operate outside of. And that is the containment of what you believe you are. And then everything outside of that does not have moral value, therefore it can't be used. And then that's essentially what creates the blind spot. Does that make sense?
Yes. So
Okay.
look forward to Peterson's
Right.
take on it. Go ahead.
Right. So Peterson comes into the picture, late 19th century. It's weird saying that, but his main purpose is to try to figure out why we have these beliefs and why we hold them so dearly. Why, for him, it was the Cold War, two superpowers holding nuclear arms at each other and both seeming to be fully willing to destroy the entire game, even though annihilation was 100% guaranteed. And for Peterson, it was like, it just seems so insane that they'd be willing to die to defend a belief that wouldn't exist if they died, right? It seems very contradictory. But in doing this, he also maps out how we have beliefs and why these beliefs are actually extremely valuable to us. And for him, he believes that we create hierarchical maps of meaning and one of them is how we perceive ourselves and how we define ourselves. And for him, it's essentially how the ego understands its own structure. And you may use very abstract categories. For him, he uses good person as one of the top traits, top sections. And then below that would be all the things that make up a good person. So good boyfriend, good brother, good co-worker, all these different subtraits. And then each one breaks down and you keep doing that up until to the point you get to just purely physical embodied actions. So in other words, you go from abstraction to physical actions. And this structure and how he imagines that really plays a part in what he adds to this idea of the shadow. Because what he points out, which is exactly what Shrikant, you're just right around you're around the curve on that one, is that whenever you create one of these categories, for example, if you say, I'm a pacifist, if you say, I'm celibate, if you say, I'm generous, and you self-identify as that, you've created a moral structure where now you have a conceptualization of yourself that is extremely limited to what it can and can't do. And following Jung's ideas, the idea is like, well, no, you are 100% capable of doing those things. You may just have never been in a situation where you needed to do those things. So for Peterson, it's literally a structure of yourself that collapses whenever any encounter with the shadow challenges that categorization. Because once that categorization, if, for example, you say you are a pacifist, right? And you get in a situation that is so aggressive or so dangerous that you react in extreme violence. And then maybe you even enjoy it, or you enjoy the power that comes from that. Well, now, not only is that pacifist categorization that you've created for yourself wrong, but so is every other substructure that was dependent on that. And that's when you have a full collapse of that entire structure, right? So for Peterson, the thing that he really adds to the Jungian shadow is this idea of localized, of how important the size is, right? It can be something really, really small, something you didn't think you were capable of. That's just a quick adjustment to your map. You were just like, oh, I didn't know I could do that. Or it could be an extreme, it could go so high as to a good person, right? And that's where he quotes the brothers, comes off. I can't remember the book, but the idea that when you murder someone, it destroys your soul so deeply that you can't fix it. And the idea is you've destroyed your own conception of a good person, and you can't even remap yourself because you have nothing to start from. So that's a quick history. Real quick now, we're going to move on to why this is important and why it matters. And I feel like the best way to do that is through examples. Peterson gives an example, and he asks us to imagine a father who hasn't integrated their aggression. So this is someone who sees themselves as someone who, nah, I'm not an angry person, I'm not an aggressive person. And what, but he's a first-time father, and, the child naturally is going to push the boundaries and see how far he can push things. And once that aggression does come out, the father has no capacity to control, mostly because he doesn't even understand that side of himself. And there's this huge explosion, or this huge aggression, or let's say, he hits the child a lot. The child now looks at his father and says, okay, I never want to be like that. And in that act, and if it's a genuine act, in that act, he classifies himself as a moral structure. But in doing so, he also excludes not just the negative aspects of aggression, but also the positives and all the practical uses that aggression may have. So it's not just a trade-off it's always a trade-off of all the utility that the things that are in the shadow are disregarded. So it's not just that you can't get in a fight or that you can't do something that you normally may not want to do anyway, but it means that you have no leverage or recourse. And why is this important? Why, for example, continuing with the example of aggression, why is the sacrificing of aggression a possibly very detrimental thing to do? Well, we can imagine several situations in which aggression is going to be needed. Some of these might be day-to-day, some of these might be very extreme scenarios. One extreme scenario may be he may need his aggression simply to protect himself or to protect others. And without any capacity to even understand that, there's really no option. You can't just, you can maybe let it out, but if you aren't even comfortable in that setting, you aren't aware of the tools you even have for this problem. Another one is he may be being used or abused. And this doesn't necessarily mean to the extreme. It may be in a car salesman who is just overly aggressive and is just very much railroading anything you do, and any protest you put up, the person just continues to push through you. And if you're not able to know how to use your aggression or know how to push back, there is no recourse there. Another one is being pushed to the point where he has to stand up for himself, or even just aggression to accomplish a goal. This may be just a job interview or any other form of negotiation where you are attempting to advocate for yourself, or even simply any competition, right? Where the point is to win. That requires some embodiment of aggression. And a lot of times what a lot of people will find is aggression comes out in games where it may not come out anywhere else because it's a more socially acceptable area. And for Peterson, he points out something that I think is really meaningful. And he says, without aggression, you lose the ability to truly say no. Because essentially when you say no, what you're really saying, what that's shorthand for is, no, I am not going to do that. And I need you to stop pursuing that. If you do not stop pursuing that, something that you don't like I will do something that you don't like, and I'm willing to take it further than you are. Right? I'm more invested in saying no than you are in saying yes. And for Peterson, he points out, if you can't do that, either in a negotiation or in most situations, then there really isn't any reason for that person to listen to you. If you don't have any leverage for why they should stop, or if you telling them to stop doesn't actually stop them, it's like they may just keep going and you have no other recourse there. So that's just one dimension of why integration, especially of aggression, would be very useful. But moving more to like a very Peterson point of view, in some cases, the lack of awareness of the shadow can also completely destroy your map of yourself.
Roger, let me go ahead and ask a clarificatory question.
Yeah.
Now, Peterson is very big on morality here, but this is an example of somebody making a moral judgment that aggression is bad and kind of throwing baby with the bathwater. So what is it that distinguishes a moral evaluation, which is good, and moral evaluation, which creates a shadow?
Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So what, sorry about that. Let me try to phrase it another way. So in this case, this person made a moral evaluation that aggression is bad. And in the process, threw away ability of taking aggressive action to actually defend your values, which you need to have. So he made a moral judgment which was too broad, and it included kind of wrong, included things which would actually hurt himself.
Right.
So what is it that separates, and that obviously creates, a shadow, that an inability. It's trying to kind of leave behind or not pay attention to parts of life which require aggression. So in the process of having this concept of, moral evaluation that aggression is bad, he has created a shadow. So my question is, what kind of moral evaluation does not create shadow, in the sense that what is it that, what is the difference between a proper morality and a moral evaluation which actually undercuts you to some extent?
Gotcha. Whether you're in control or not. So for both Jung and Peterson, the idea isn't so much that by identifying it, you're freed from it. It's simply that by identifying it, you now know more of who you actually are. So that person who may not want to use aggression, for example, for them, a shadow work or trying to integrate that may be them having to look at just how much they are like their father, and just how much they too can be just as bad and just as destructive as their father was, or even, much more realistically, much, much worse. And in doing that, it allows them to know a part of themselves that they otherwise wouldn't be familiar with. So then when situations like this arise, where aggression is needed, because one of two things can happen, right? And we're going to get into that later, but one of two things can happen. You either don't have the tool, or you don't know how to use it, right, properly, or you have what Jung called shadow possession, which is, if you have anger issues, maybe when you see red, or when, things kind of go out of your control, or when we've all had it where out of nowhere you suddenly act in a certain way, and then, either through crisis or emergency or through necessity of the situation. And it's only afterwards that you realize that you weren't actually that in control. You didn't even actually know what was going on. And that's because the tool will either not be available to you, or if it does become available to you, it's in its own control, and you are not consciously in control of that. And that is where because you don't have control, you just don't know what the result is, right? So if you don't have any control of your aggression, you may go way, way too far. You may overreact. You may overindulge in those emotions, right? So the idea is knowing very well that you could punch your boss makes it less likely for you to punch your boss, right? So it's the idea that you're very capable in understanding that, like, that's actually a part of me that would love to do that.
Thanks.
Right? So, okay. Sorry. Okay, right. So there's also the capacity for encounter with the shadow to completely collapse your own map of yourself. And he gives a good example that I've elaborated and added a little bit more details for vividness, but of soldiers when they witness war. And for him, this is an example of what we understand as PTSD. And it's the idea that we have a map of what the world is. In the same way we have a map of ourselves, we have a map of what the world is and what we want the world to be. And you can imagine an 18-year-old boy, joins the army, goes to fight in a war overseas. He's brought up on action movies and video games. Those are his main experience with the outside world of places he hasn't been in. So that's his conceptualization of reality. That's what he believes reality functions like, or at least functions similar to. It's not necessarily that he believes it's a video game, but that the moral dynamics there are kind of what he expects. And you can imagine him encountering malevolence. You can imagine him encountering and noticing that the good guys, the guys that he's fighting with, embody a lot of the bad things that maybe he never expected the good guys were capable of embodying, or even seeing an enemy and seeing someone else enjoy and revel in complete destruction and chaos, which from his perspective was not something that should exist, or it wasn't something that he had conceptualized as possible. Another example of this would be, and the one that I think is even more crucial, is when he sees that in himself, when he starts to see that maybe he himself enjoys the capacity to take a life. Maybe he himself enjoys the power and authority that comes with being in a situation where there are no laws. And he doesn't know how to account for that because, again, or let's say he commits a war crime. What happens to that idea of I'm a good person? What happens to that idea of I'm virtuous? I only fight for the good. So if you have a very naive conception of who you are as a person, then you can't account for anything that challenges those views or that exists in a conception where that shouldn't exist, right? If you really are a good person, you shouldn't be committing war crimes, right? But almost all of us naturally default to believing that that's the case. And I wanted to also touch on shadow possession. I wrote a couple of things here that one of them was, if you think you would never hurt someone, it also means that you have no idea what you would become if you were in a situation where you had to. If you don't believe you could hate your children, you have no idea what you would become if they did manage to get you to hate them. It's like the fact that you're not aware of what those situations are doesn't necessitate that they're not possible. It simply necessitates that you don't know. And so for Peterson, the idea is that as you become more aware, you gain more control of those aspects of your psyche. And there are aspects of your psyche that we all have, and there are aspects of our psyche that are vital for us to understand in his perspective, because not understanding those is how the world marches into, a genocidal madness. It's the idea of people that don't understand just how dangerous and what they are actually capable of. It's all that allows us to kind of stumble into these disasters rather than understanding full well that, there's plenty of darkness in us. So now we're going to jump real quick, start giving the general abstraction. So what can you actually do? How does this all work? Well, there is some good news as far as when does the integration of the shadow happen? One, it naturally happens just by aging. And the reason is, as you age, you have to change. You will meet different problems that your current status no longer has. And you can imagine from Peterson's perspective, this is what you would call a descent into chaos, or anything that challenges how you currently are approaching the world. At that point, you have two options. You have the Freudian option of regression, which is, I'm just going to go back to a previous setting that I already had because that's safer and easier and I already know that. Or you have the idea of the descent down to the underground or to the shadow, to find something that is valuable that will resolve the problem, to come back and then implement that then resolves the issue, right? Symbolically speaking, it's a dive into the depths and then bringing them back out so that it allows you to handle this new problem. But in doing so, you always have to sacrifice a part of you. And for Peterson, that's the part of the map, where instead of a good person, you change what a good person means to you to account for all those extra aspects that you've discovered of yourself. Another way is through encounters with the shadow, through seeing aspects of you or aspects of others that you may not have thought were possible, or they may have just never conceived or considered that were very human and quite normal, right? Another one is shadow work, which is where you purposely try to explore the dark sides of you. One is just crisis, like I mentioned. And another one, and one of my favorite ones, is exploring hero myths and other representations through art. If you notice all through our media, you'll find constant representations of shadows. Even one of the most ridiculous ones I've seen recently was the newest Star Wars movie. Not a great movie, but in the middle of the movie, inexplicably, the hero is confronted by essentially what is essentially a clone of a copy of herself, wearing all black with sharp teeth and a red lightsaber, right? The exact opposite of her, which symbolically speaking is exactly what the ego is to the shadow, right? It's an exact opposite. It's all the things that were not selected, that were not conscious. And once you start paying attention to that pattern, you'll see it all around art and all around a lot of hero representations. So finally, I want to get down to the, quick and dirty practical. How do we actually proactively integrate more aspects of our shadow? And these are just a couple ideas. By no means are they exhaustive. But one of them is, and one that I found quite useful, is understanding shadow projection. And shadow projection is the idea that when you truly hate or resent someone, that likely says much more about you than it says about that person. You can disagree with someone, but when it's in a more visceral or emotional reaction, you can also ask yourself why that is. Because a lot of times, I can give you an example. For me, there was this person that I used to work with who was extremely vocal and extremely proactive in social justice issues. And I, for some reason, just could not stand her, and I didn't know why. And I felt a true, genuine resentment for her, and I was trying to explore why. And eventually, I listed all these reasons in my head, and I was like, yeah, but those are just political things that I don't agree with. It's not a reason to hate someone. And then it clicked on me that for her, because she was constantly using her identity and her culture, it was something I lacked. I'm Mexican American, but I grew up as an immigrant. I never grew up having any connection to my culture. And I very quickly, once I realized that, it was like, oh, that's exactly why I resent her. I resent her because she has something that I kind of would actually like to have, and I don't. And that's exactly why that resentment's there and why I don't like her. So that's one example of seeing the people you hate and trying to understand why you actually hate them, and trying to see it within the perspective of, it might be something that you lack, something you don't understand. And more than likely, you probably don't know them well enough to actually hate them in the way you do. I mean, there are maybe reasons, nobody needs to send me an email of like why someone really truly does deserve to be hated, but there are plenty of reasons where that might not be the case, but it's a useful perspective to practice. Another one that Peterson really recommends is essentially role-playing a perspective that is seen as evil or that's opposite of yourself. One ways that I practice this, I visited the killing fields in Cambodia several times over. For those that don't know, it's essentially a location where mass genocide happened that almost no one talks about. And I've been there plenty of times before, and almost every time I would go to the killing fields and also to Site 21, which was essentially a prison where people were tortured, raped, and killed. It's very natural for you want to imagine yourself as a prisoner. And the last time I went there, I'd been reading this stuff. I tried to imagine myself as a guard and see if I could find the part of me that would genuinely enjoy and like that power in that part. So I walked around imagining that I had, all these people that I knew and had full and total complete dominating power over them. And sure enough, there it was, right? This not a part that I'm proud of, not a part that I like, the part that actually scares me quite a lot. It's not something I want to accept about myself, but a part that is definitely there. And kind of trying to find those different aspects. Another one is questioning. It's just a genuine questioning of your self-perception. One that's really important is the exploration of the contrasexual traits. Essentially, finding the ideas of your, not the ideas, but the traits that are opposite your sex. So if you're male and embody a very masculine life and personality, trying your best to explore the feminine aspects of yourself, which, especially for men in today's society is very difficult. And for women, in the exact opposite way, trying to find the very masculine, more dominating and assertive parts of themselves. And in that, what you do is you kind of open your toolbox to what options are available for you. And the last one that I also think is also very valuable, and that Peterson uses to some extent on his personality class, is mapping the opposites of your personality. So for me, for example, I'm extremely disagreeable. So something that's extremely hard for me to do is to be very agreeable, or to be very, very nice to people that I barely know. And it's a genuine difficulty for me to do it. And it seems very easy and very simple. And I find that I struggle a lot to try to push myself in the opposite direction of what I would naturally normally go to. But in doing that, it allows me to kind of control and have extra tools and extra abilities to adapt. But essentially, those are a couple of just practical ways that you can try to explore your shadow and embody a more full you and a better understanding of you. And I do just want to conclude with this idea that Peterson puts out, that it's important to consider that one cannot be said to be moral unless one has the choice to be immoral, right? Because it is the fact that that person is truly capable of evil and chooses not to, that is what gives it value. Anything else is just a justification for a choice you never had. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Roger. So we have got, I was planning to ask you questions, but we've got 7 people lining up,
Perfect.
already lined up to ask you questions. And folks, so the rules here is whenever you want to ask a question, there are 4 rules that we've used in our meetups for the last 3.5 years. Number 1, raise your hand. The way you raise your hand is to either type a question or you can raise your hand in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. We're talking about the concept of shadow and shadow integration. So that's the topic today. So keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. There's a lot of things that a lot of people have to say. You want to listen to all of that. So keep your questions brief. Number 4, and you can make not only questions, but you can not only ask questions, but you can make comments, but keep them brief. Number 4, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything anybody says, but please be courteous in doing that. So those are the 4 rules. It's going to be Chase, then Daniel, then Melissa, then Tova, then Stephanie, Dave, Carl, and Claire. So Chase, you're up.
Awesome, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Great. So my question, I think there's a delay on my end, so I'm just going to talk through my question and hopefully you get it, and then I'll just mute and let you answer. So you sort of already answered one part of my question, so I'll just focus on a specific aspect of it. But I'm wondering about your thoughts on proactively growing your moral maps in the way that you were just talking about, but specifically to mitigate against some of the reactionary impact of the really dark, chaotic sides of reality. So if you go to that example of the father who's abusive, how would you suggest someone build their own moral maps such that if they encounter someone with that level of aggression or something catastrophic in life, that they don't have that reaction that the child has, who says, oh, I'm never going to be like that, or I'm never going to do that, and they end up making that decision, like Shrikant said, where they've actually caused some sort of damage to their own sort of moral structures. How do you specifically mitigate against those encounters with the darker sides of reality?
Right. So for Peterson, and possibly for Jung, but definitely for Peterson, this is kind of part of the human development. You can think of it as the first half of your life, you are just thrown into the world as this extremely adaptive mammal. And the way you define a successful strategy is by trying a bunch of different things. And then what works is you just keep what works, you repeat, essentially. So then naturally you're going to have to develop a shadow. But then after that, the work is that you then have to go back and retrace those steps and see what are all the things that you've had to put away to get past your first half of your life to the point where you're stable, and then you can go back and repair. But it's almost a necessity to have that split and to have those parts of you kind of closed off. For Jung, it was something that was inevitable, and that also there wasn't a quick and dirty resolution of it. For Jung, that was one of the biggest, highest goals in life, was to try your best to become a true individual, to individuate, and for him it meant being fully aware of who you actually are in totality, not just the you that you're conscious of, but rather to bring the shadow as much to the consciousness as you can, because that would only allow you to better understand you and to better understand your full capacity. It's the idea that you're essentially have to limit yourself first, and then only through a lot of work can you start to learn that those limitations no longer need to be applied.
Daniel, next. So what you do is that whenever you're called upon to speak, you unmute yourself, speak, and then just mute yourself. No follow-up questions, because we want to get to as many different people's questions as possible. Okay. So it's going to be Daniel, then Melissa. Daniel, go ahead.
If we love the darkness of the shadow so that the light will not expose us, and it seems that human beings live lives of denial, how can that love of the darkness, that threatening light, how can it be changed into a genuine want to discover ourselves, which can be so painful? And so my question, I guess my real question is, do we know when we're really confronting ourselves? Or when we do think we've gotten insight, is it just a very, very partial insight of what's buried in the unconscious?
Yeah. So for Peterson, and he loves to quote Jung on this, is the depth of the shadow reaches all the way down to hell. So it's this idea that whatever you're able to pull out, there's always more to pull out. There's always a darker part of you. Like, unless, like, the idea is that it's limitless, that anything that humans in history have done, you yourself are fully capable of and enjoying, right? And you're fully capable of mimicking other humans' actions in the same sense that, and there's some where it's easy. So for example, for me, I boxed for like 10 years, and aggression is quite easy for me to integrate. But there's still things that for me, I still can't bring myself to even consider. For example, being a child molester, right? Trying to fully understand psychologically the dark side of why people would like that. Why would that be appealing? And fully accepting and knowing that that's a part of you too, right? The most extremes. You can go to the most extremes and put in work there, or being a school shooter, or some of the darkest expressions of humanity. For Jung, were internal, and for Peterson, that's why he's always quoting horrible, incidents in books. It's kind of this idea that you're never gonna fully get to it, but the more you integrate, the better off you're going to be, the more prepared you're going to be. Because in the same way, in pulling that out, you also pull out a useful tool, because you better understand yourself, and you better know what things could take you there and how to then lead your way away from that.
Melissa, you're next.
Thank you. So regarding aggression and shadow integration, and I think about E.B. Winnicott, about true and false self, where does the planned, controlled escalation intended to convey acuity of irritation fall in what you're discussing? And I think, like, the example when you said, you say no, but if, that's a pretty tempered or timid, if you don't mind me saying, way, but something that's calculated, non-impulsive, and controlled and measured, intended to convey the acuity of the irritation. Where is that line? and how do you I guess remedy that line between shadow integration and what I would say A.B. Winnicott true and false self, because it becomes a very slippery slope. While no is not that aggressive, maybe to some folks, maybe doing something right, more aggressive and is obviously more threatening. So,
I'm not really familiar with the theory you're referencing, but if I understand it right, what you're essentially saying is I guess could you rephrase the question? I'm not quite sure what you're trying to ask, but I'm also not familiar with the work you're mentioning. So,
well, I'm just talking about, okay, so let's say just with shadow integration and how you use the example of aggression. And saying no is a form of aggression, right? Saying, I'm saying no, and that should give you a warning that I will become more escalated. At what point does that controlled and measured, at least perceptually, on part of the aggressor, fall into the shadow integration component of the conceptual map?
Right. So I think I get what you mean. So it's more of like, for example, if I think I'm a nice person, right? And then let's go with a really extreme example. My child just keeps asking me why for an hour, right? Or asks me for a toy, right? And he doesn't stop asking, he doesn't stop asking, he doesn't stop asking. I'm saying no, and I'm saying no, and I'm saying no. And, I'm pushing it further and further and further. At that point, I need to have an understanding that eventually that can cross the line. And I need to be fully aware of what that's going to lead to and what I would ever do if it gets to that point. Because if I don't, then it's just going to happen. And I don't know, nor will I be in control of what that leads to, right? And I'm using an extreme example as in like the child just pushes it to your limit, right? Let's assume you're also very high neuroticism, it just had a horrible day and it's just the perfect storm, right? But I would say the shadow, the sense of the shadow is whether it's conscious or not. So if you're aware of that, then it's no longer part of the shadow, it's part of the ego. It's moved to the ego. If you're unaware, if you don't know where the situation could lead to, or you have a false belief, maybe with the fake self that you're referring to, of like, oh, I would never hit my children. I'm not that kind of parent, right? And then someone pushes you to the limit, and before you know it, you do. It's like, then it was simply because you didn't understand that you are actually that person. You just didn't want to look at it. If that makes sense. Is that
okay? Let's go to the next question. Towa, it's you're up next.
So I used a lot of words, and I'm not sure what those words meant in how I asked the question, but I guess what I think I was asking was like, I guess if we were to use Peterson, and if I remember correctly, what he was trying to say by saying that we are all part monster, like in understanding what part monster we are, can one be broken by this process? And if so, is that, or arguably could it be seen as like a dark night of the soul? And if so, why?
Oh yeah, we definitely can be broken, and encounters with the shadow, like even in the example like I mentioned of the soldier, right? Of seeing himself do things that he would have never imagined himself to do, that changes not just the fact of who he thought he was, but because it changes the fact of who he thought he was in a big category of, let's say, their conception of a good person is one of those is does not kill, right? Maybe he's religious and has the 10 Commandments, right? And then that structure gets destroyed because he did kill someone. And maybe he killed someone that was innocent or wasn't, a fair target. That then can destroy his own conception of himself. And once you do that, he doesn't know who he is anymore. And at that point, they need to rebuild the map completely. And that can take lots of years, a lot of therapy, and a lot of work, mostly because they don't know how to conceptualize themselves, or if it's an external threat, the world around them. So it is a threat, especially if the encounter happens when you're not in control, right? When it's not voluntarily. And for Peterson, that's kind of what he points out, that like for humans, that's why there's always the voluntary sacrifice. The voluntary sacrifice is the hero that lets a part of him die, or at least it's normally the hero dies and then is reborn in some new, stronger way. It's the symbolic element of a part of that structure falling apart in a new structure that's more adaptive and can account for all the differences coming to.
Okay, next question is from Deef. Deef, go ahead.
It's hard to track all the 3 different layers of shadow, but from what I gathered, can the way of using your imagination to explore your dark side, blah, 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 or shadow work, however people are practicing it, whatever mechanism, just get hijacked by the ego and still reinforce slave morality because you're still egocentric or you have no perspective?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like you can definitely get stuck in, the self-gratification of just being like, oh yeah, that was easy, shadow already integrated, on to the next, transcendent level. But the idea is this is a full lifelong process, right? And like I think Jung said that the reason we can never reach perfection is because by the time we get to know ourselves, we'll already be dead, right? It's the idea that like we won't even, like, because life is so short, we probably won't ever even get to the point to fully understanding ourselves, let alone perfecting that part later. So the idea is first to just individuate, to understand the different aspects of yourself first.
Okay, next up is Carl. Carl, go ahead.
I don't really have a question. It's been answered.
Okay, next up is Claire.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is part of, I think when Peterson talks about this stuff, you see him become the most emotional, right? And I think that this is real. I feel sort of heavy listening to all this again, and I think it's really important to be reminded of. My question is about the kind of last quarter of the integration process. So I think what I understand really clearly is identifying the shadow, seeing it. I think that's something that I see personally as my capacity for evil and how that's personal. But I'm wondering then, like, what is the final step of rectifying that? I assume it's like custom. But what is, like, after identifying and seeing it, what does integration really mean in terms of finishing that off, or are you ever really done?
Taking in the thing that you've learned you're capable of and finding a way that's useful. So you can think of it like for example, Freud had a similar idea to this, but it's, for example, someone who is really into mutilating bodies or cutting bodies. For some reason, they're just really into that. But then, uses that to then become a surgeon or to become a mortician, to find something where that same, the very thing that could be extremely dangerous is put to use for yourself. It's I always kind of conceptualize it myself personally as tools, and that's all it is, right? Like you have the tool of anger. If you choose to never use the tool of anger, it's like, all right, cool, but now you're just going to live your life with one less tool, and having that option is always going to be more useful. And if you have a situation where you do need to use that tool, it's much better that you know how to use it and you know what steps are going to lead you to use it than to just assume and not know when that's supposed to come out or when it will come out.
So would you say if you're, sorry, no follow-up question.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Would you say if you're not actively using an element of your shadow, then you're not, like, resisting the shadow part of it?
Oh no, you don't. No, not necessarily. Like, it may just not have a use, right? Yeah. So it's more a matter of understanding full well what, like I said, like what will lead to it and what steps will happen. And essentially, like, especially with something like aggression or even just sexuality, right? Because those are the two most difficult things to integrate in society. For aggression, it's like, well, knowing what steps you're gonna hit before you get there, so that when it gets to one of the final steps, you're like, okay, do I need to leave the situation or do I need to take this to the next step, right? And where it's a choice and where you're consciously choosing, do I want to take this to the next step because I know what comes next, as opposed to not knowing what comes next and just having a reaction.
Okay, excellent. So I want to say a couple of things. Firstly, we are doing a follow-up on shadow in a very big way this Thursday. So on this Thursday, I'm going to have about maybe somewhere between 5 to 7 Jungian psychotherapists talking about shadow. Okay. Secondly, in the chat here, I have sent you a link of the most concise presentation of shadow by Jung. Okay, I'm going to post it on the Thursday meetup as well. So on Thursday, what we're going to do is that we're going to be talking about, I'm going to be asking 3 questions to all these people. And each of them, who have between 10 to 30 years of experience applying this concept of shadow to hundreds of their patients, are going to try to answer those 3 questions. First is, what is shadow? What do you think is shadow? What's your best description of it? Number 2, what are the challenges and rewards of integrating shadow into your person? And the last one is, how is shadow work actually done by a person? So those are, we're going to drill down into this, this entire concept. So I'm really looking forward to that. Now, we do have time for a couple more questions if you would like. So does anybody have questions? You can just go ahead and raise your hand at this point. All right. If there are no questions, what we will do next is we will break it up. Actually, you know what, Roger, let me ask you one question. Mm-hmm. And this is about kind of integration of shadow. And one of the ways in which I think about it, see, I am not as familiar with Jung as you are. I've tried to learn Jung, but Jung to me is like an ocean. Like every time I go to it, I think that I've gotten something. I'm kind of at the edge, just waiting around. And every time I come to it, I see kind of new depths there. So I don't know that I've gotten this idea well. And that's one of the reasons I'm doing these meetups, to learn from all these people, including you. So the way I see it is that it seems to be all about kind of accepting yourself. Instead of having like a prejudgment of this is how things should be, and this is what I should be, it is kind of having the general attitude of saying, I accept what I am, and what am I? And being kind of genuinely curious about that. And even if it makes you uncomfortable, starting with that. I think that's that kind of mental stance of kind of having this kind of deep acceptance of yourself as a starting point is how I see kind of the general attitude. Would you agree? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, because essentially, and I think with the shadow, a lot of people really focus on the bad parts or the parts that are seen as negative. I think because it just sticks out much more obvious, and I think most people struggle more with that aspect. But there's also plenty of positive notes to that too. For example, if you do have low confidence, right? Being able to find that part of you that actually does believe in you, that actually does have that confidence, that sense of self-assuredness, right? Or any part that's been repressed. It doesn't necessarily have to be bad. It's just parts that weren't allowed during your development, essentially. And it's essentially you trying to understand the full you and being fully okay with that, and not making an assumption that you already understand yourself so well that you can fully categorize yourself, right? And then just be like, oh, I am this, and therefore I could never step out of these boundaries, but rather try to understand that you very much could, but that doesn't mean that, that system fully falls apart. Is that it needs to adapt and account for all those.
So the next questions are from David, followed by Kate, followed by Tova, and then Daniel. David, go ahead.
Thanks, Roger. So I had a question about the earlier part of your talk and about the maps themselves and about the morality. And if you just had any comment about the relationship between that and I guess what's related to persuasion or people's inherent focus on consistency. In other words, people will make some sort of a statement early on as one way of persuasion, and then they will get fixed and stay in that bias and have a great deal of difficulty of reassessing the situation. I was wondering how that related to your earlier comments, or if you had any just response to that related to the maps and the bias you were talking about there.
Yeah. So yeah, and that Peterson really talks about that as far as, and it goes back to the same idea of beliefs, right? And why we seem to struggle so much with these beliefs. And for Peterson, he believes that the earlier on you kind of encode that belief into yourself, the more catastrophic it can be if that belief is unvalidated. And that's why we hang on, especially to things that we were taught very, very young, really dearly. So, and one of the reasons is the longer you categorize yourself in a certain way, the more other categorizations start to become dependent on that categorization, right? So if you think let's say that you are raised religious, right? So you're raised that God, your outside worldview is God exists, he's judging you, he has these rules, he has all these expectations. So then you identify as good Christian. What's a good Christian? And you have all these different things. And instead of good person, you have good Christian, because the world itself has manifested itself as, the king, a reality that's ruled by a God. And then you find out, or you have your faith shattered in some way. Well, that not only breaks your map of the outside world, but also breaks your map of your own inside world. So it's much, much easier to just say, no, you're wrong. No, there is one. And I'm not going to listen to all that mumbo jumbo science you're throwing at me. I'm not going to humor it, because the risk of accepting that is too great, and there's too much pain there that's on the line.
I'm giving priority to people who have not asked the questions before. So it's going to be Kate and then David Dittmore. Kate, go ahead.
Well, I'm just remembering what I knew about Jung working with dreams, and I'm wondering if that that was a tool for uncovering the dark side, or what relationship that had. Yeah, if you could elaborate about that at all.
Yeah, so from what I've read from Jung, he does make several points where he believed that there's a lot of symbolism in dreams that directly point to the shadow. So normally that can be, some of the examples that he gives are people wearing black hoods, or almost always someone that's embodied in full black or negative, or the opposite in some way. And that normally was a symbolic representation of the shadow, and sometimes not either the integration, because Jung believed that the self is constantly always trying to unite the ego with the shadow. So this idea that, there would be the shadowy figure that either attacks you or is always following you or is doing these things may not necessarily be a simulation of threat, but rather an attempt to integrate a part of you that you might be avoiding or you might not be wanting to look at. But that's probably as far as I can go from my knowledge that I know of.
Roger, could you talk a little bit about Jung's concept of self? What does he mean by self?
Oof. Yeah. So I guess I can keep it relevant to this, because otherwise it's a pretty long talk. So for Jung, the self was kind of the source of all potential use. And that's, a really heady concept. But for this purpose, what the self was also always trying to do was trying to bring you to your full potential. And the best way to achieve your full potential is, like I said, with the toolbox, is give you the most amount of tools, give you the most variability and variety. And the best way to achieve that is to integrate with all the parts of you that you're not using. And the more you're able to integrate all those aspects, the more capable and dynamic you are to adapt to then embody and create the best you.
Excellent. David Ditmore, you're next. David, you need to unmute yourself. David, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, what always confused me about
Oh, you cut off.
dipping into the subconscious all the time, of getting things out of the subconscious. And to me, the subconscious is not accessible except through dreams. But could you make that a little bit clearer?
Yeah, so it's unconscious. So it's not so much that it's inaccessible, it's that you're not aware of it. So, for example, a shadow work that you may indulge in is reading a history book of someone that either went through a tragedy or that caused the tragedy. And when you try to kind of ask yourself, it's like, all right, how could I get myself to a point where I would totally want to do that, where that would actually be my own idea, with no external pressures, no external justifications, no, oh, well, if I was born in their life and I was raised that way, but like truly just me now as me, is there a part of me that would genuinely try to make that happen and truly trying to seek that out, and almost assuming that there might be a part of you that will. And almost always you'll find that if you really go deep down enough, you will find a part of you that's like, yeah, that'd actually be pretty fun, right? And so it's not like a direct full exploration, like you're able to see everything, right? It's not like, for example, taking hallucinogenics or having a really vivid dream. It's much more of you go directly looking for one very precise thing and you pull that part out. And that's why I think it's also that idea of like, it's too much for us to ever fully pull everything out, right? Because it's like in that you have to be very precise and very intentional with what you're looking for.
All right. Thank you, Roger. So we'll go to the next phase where we're going to divide into breakout rooms. And Roger will be back on Tuesday talking further. And if you're interested in this topic, don't miss the Jung series. That's going to be Thursdays at 9 o'clock and Sundays at 2:30 p.m. All right, so just stay put. I'm going to divide you into groups